On the night of March 20th, 2024, the small town of Millbrook, Oregon, with its meager 3,200 inhabitants, became the scene of an incident that would challenge everything local authorities knew about police work. What began as a routine call to the Harlow County Sheriff's Office would end up shaking the foundations of the reality that everyone believed to be solid and immutable. Officer Brad Kellerman, a 15-year veteran of the department, was finishing his night shift when he received the call on the radio. It was exactly 11:32 p.m. when the dispatcher reported a disturbance on a rural property located on Old Mill Road, approximately 8 kilometers north of the city. The complaint came from Martha Henderson, a 72-year-old woman who had lived alone since her husband's death. She reported seeing someone prowling around her barn, tampering with her tools and frightening her animals. Kellerman sighed, figuring it was just another case of bored teenagers looking for fun, or perhaps some meth addict trying to steal equipment to sell. He informed the dispatcher that he was on his way and turned his vehicle toward the Henderson property. The road was dark, illuminated only by his vehicle's headlights cutting through the mist that was beginning to form over the fields. The trees on either side created shadowy corridors that seemed to swallow the light. Upon arriving at the property 15 minutes later, Kellerman immediately realized something was wrong. The lights in the main house were all on, which was unusual for that time of day. Mrs. Henderson's puppies, normally noisy and territorial, were completely silent. He parked his vehicle near the entrance and activated his BODYCAM before exiting the car. Standard procedure required all interactions to be recorded, and Kellerman was meticulous about the protocols. Mrs. Henderson rushed out the front door before he could even knock. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a genuine terror that Kellerman had rarely seen in his years of service. She pointed with trembling hands toward the barn, located about 50 meters from the main house. The old wooden structure was partially illuminated by a security light that flickered intermittently, creating dancing shadows that moved disturbingly. She said she had seen him again just a few minutes ago. He described a tall, ungainly figure dressed in dark clothes that seemed ill-fitting. The intruder had entered the barn, and she could swear she heard strange sounds coming from inside, like something was dragging metal against metal. Kellerman tried to reassure her, saying he would check, but that she should remain inside with the doors locked until he was sure everything was safe. With his flashlight in his left hand and his right hand resting on the gun in its holster, Kellerman walked slowly toward the barn. The grass was wet with night dew, and his footsteps made a muffled sound against the ground. He could hear his own breathing amplified by the absolute stillness that enveloped the property. Even the crickets seemed to have ceased their nocturnal symphony. The BODYCAM captured everything, the beam of light from his flashlight creating circles of visibility amidst the oppressive darkness. When he was about 10 meters from the barn, Kellerman heard a sound that made him stop instantly. It was a kind of breathing, but it wasn't human. It was heavy, labored, as if something large was struggling to get air in and out of its lungs. There was also a scratching sound, like nails or claws scraping against wood. He announced his presence, identifying himself as a police officer and ordering whoever was in the barn to come out immediately with their hands visible. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Kellerman could feel his heart racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He approached the half-open barn door and, with a swift movement, pushed it wide open while illuminating the interior with his flashlight. What he saw chilled his blood. In the far corner of the structure, partially hidden behind an old, rusty tractor, was a figure that definitely seemed human at first glance, but there was something profoundly wrong with it. The figure was turned away, but Kellerman could see that it was tall, probably around 6'3". It was wearing what appeared to be a grey wool jacket and dark trousers, but the clothes hung strangely, as if they were too big or as if the body underneath didn't have the proper bone structure to support them adequately. The arms seemed too long, the hands hanging much lower than where they should naturally end, And there was something about the way the head was positioned on the shoulders, an angle that didn't seem anatomically correct. Kellerman again ordered the figure to turn around and show its hands. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure began to move, but it didn't turn around like a normal person would. Instead, the head spun first, independently of the body, rotating at an impossible angle until the face became visible. And what a face it was. The body cam captured every horrific detail. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over bones that seemed to be in the wrong places. The eyes were too large, completely black, with no visible white, reflecting the flashlight's light like the eyes of a nocturnal animal. The mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were jagged and sharp, more like those of a predator than a human being. Officer Kellerman instinctively recoiled, his hand flying to his weapon. He yelled at the creature to stay where it was, but his voice betrayed the fear he felt. The thing didn't obey. Instead, the rest of its body began to turn to follow its head, but the movements were all wrong, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. And then, with a speed that completely contradicted its previous clumsy movements, the creature lunged at him. Kellerman barely had time to react. He drew his weapon and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The body cam captured the flashes of the gunfire, briefly illuminating the interior of the barn. At least one of the shots clearly hit its target. Kellerman could see the impact on the creature's chest, but it didn't stop. There was no blood, no cry of pain, nothing to indicate that the projectiles had any effect. The thing kept advancing, moving with that unnatural speed, and Kellerman knew he couldn't let it catch him. He turned and ran, exiting the barn and rushing back toward his patrol car. His lungs burned as he yelled into the radio for backup, explaining that there was an active threat and that shots had been fired. The dispatcher tried to ask questions, but he didn't have time for detailed explanations. Behind him, he could hear the creature emerging from the barn, and the sound of its footsteps was like nothing he had ever heard. It wasn't the normal sound of feet hitting the ground, but something heavier, more deliberate, as if each step required a conscious effort. Kellerman reached his patrol car and quickly positioned himself behind it, using the vehicle as cover while pointing his gun back at the barn. The security light was still flickering, creating that unsettling strobe light that made it difficult to follow the creature's movements. It had stopped at the barn's exit and was looking directly at him. At that moment, with the distance between them and the improved lighting, Kellerman could see even more details that his mind had struggled to process. The creature's skin wasn't just pale, it seemed to have a translucent quality, almost as if you could see shadows of something beneath. Its hands, now clearly visible, had fingers that were excessively long, with far more joints than a normal human finger should have. And there was something about the way it breathed, its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that didn't correspond to any natural breathing pattern. It was like watching someone trying to mimic human breathing without truly understanding how it worked. For several seconds, that felt like hours. They remained like that, predator and prey, staring at each other through the hazy night. Kellerman held his weapon steady, though his hands trembled. He knew the shots hadn't worked before, but it was his only defense. The creature tilted its head to the side, studying him with those empty black eyes, and Kellerman had the unsettling feeling that he was being assessed, analyzed like an interesting specimen. Then, without warning, the creature turned and began to run, but not toward the road or the house. Instead, it ran straight toward the line of trees that marked the beginning of the dense forest stretching for miles north of the Henderson property. And the way it ran was utterly unnatural. Its limbs moved in a strange coordination, like a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. But the speed was impressive. In seconds, the creature had crossed the field and disappeared among the trees. Kellerman remained behind his patrol car, his breath coming in short bursts, trying to process what he had just witnessed. His body cam had recorded everything, every horrific second. But he knew that even with the visual evidence, people would have a hard time believing it. He was certainly having a hard time, and he had seen it with his own eyes. His rational mind, trained by years of fact and evidence-based police work, struggled against what his senses had just experienced. The sound of sirens in the distance brought him back to reality. Reinforcements were arriving. 3 patrol cars appeared on the road, their flashing lights cutting through the fog. Officers jumped out of their vehicles with weapons drawn, and Kellerman had to quickly explain the situation, though his words sounded crazy even to his own ears. He said the suspect had fled into the woods, initially omitting the most disturbing details about the creature's appearance. He knew they would need to see the body cam footage to truly understand. Sergeant Michael Torres, Kellerman's superior, took command of the situation. He organized a preliminary perimeter search, checking the barn and the surrounding area of the Henderson property. They found the spent cartridges from the bullets Kellerman had fired, but there was no blood, no sign that anyone had been injured. What they did find, however, were footprints, and these footprints were impossible. They were large, very large, but the footprint pattern was incorrect. There were 5 impressions that could be toes, but they were irregularly spaced, and the pressure on the ground suggested a weight distributed in a completely different way than a normal human would walk. Torres looked at Kellerman with an expression that mixed concern and disbelief. He suggested that everyone return to the police station and review the body cam footage before deciding on the next steps. Mrs. Henderson was instructed to spend the night at a neighbor's house, and an officer was assigned to guard the property in case the intruder returned. As they drove back to town, Kellerman couldn't take his eyes off the line of dark trees, wondering what was hidden in that forest and if it would return. At the police station, the small group of officers gathered in the briefing room. The atmosphere was tense as Torres connected Kellerman's body cam to the viewing system. What they watched in the next few hours would fundamentally change how they understood the world. The footage left no room for interpretation or denial. It was all there in high-definition video. The creature in the barn, its impossible face, its unnatural movements, the way it had continued advancing even after being shot, and finally, its escape into the forest. Some of the younger officers seemed to be on the verge of panic. Others tried to rationalize what they had seen, suggesting explanations like someone wearing a mask or some kind of elaborate trick. But Kellerman knew, as did everyone who watched the footage closely, that this was not a trick or a fantasy. This was real, tangible, and profoundly wrong in a way that defied all the natural laws they knew. Torres made the decision to contact federal authorities. He called the FBI's regional office in Portland, explaining that they had an unusual situation that required specialized expertise. The agent who answered the call initially seemed skeptical, but when Torres mentioned that they had body cam footage of the entire incident, the tone changed. They told him that a team would be sent to Millbrook the following morning, and that in the meantime they should keep the area isolated and not share the footage with anyone outside the department. What Kellerman and his colleagues didn't know was that their filming had triggered very specific protocols within certain federal agencies, protocols that existed specifically to deal with encounters that challenged conventional understanding of reality. When the federal team arrived the next day, they weren't typical FBI agents. They didn't identify themselves with full names, only with titles and identification numbers. They brought specialized equipment and asked very specific questions about details that Kellerman hadn't even consciously noticed at the time. They confiscated all copies of the body cam footage, citing national security concerns. The Henderson property was placed under quarantine, with a team establishing a perimeter that extended to the tree line where the creature had disappeared. Search teams were organized, but these teams were equipped with far more than standard weapons and flashlights. They had detection equipment that Kellerman had never seen before, devices that seemed to measure things he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The search continued for 3 days. During that time, Millbrook was under what amounted to Unofficial martial law. Residents were instructed to remain in their homes after dark, and a curfew was imposed. Officially, authorities said they were looking for a dangerous and potentially armed suspect. The truth, of course, was far stranger and more disturbing. More footage had surfaced from security cameras on neighboring properties, showing glimpses of the creature moving through fields and along rural roads in the hours before Kellerman's encounter. On the third day of searching, the team found something. Deep in the forest, approximately 5 kilometers from the Henderson property, they discovered what could only be described as a campsite or temporary dwelling. There was no built structure, but there were clear signs of recent occupation. The ground was disturbed in a way that suggested something had been lying there, and there were remains of partially consumed animals, but the way they had been dismembered did not correspond to any known predator in the region. Even more disturbing were the marks left on the surrounding trees, deep scratches in the bark, far too high to have been made by any local animal, and with a pattern suggesting hands or claws with far more fingers than any terrestrial creature should have. There was also something that appeared to be some kind of secretion on the trees, a viscous substance that the team collected in special containers for later analysis. No one wanted to touch it directly, and even with gloves, the team members seemed reluctant to get too close, but the creature itself was never found. Despite days of intensive searches with specialized teams and advanced equipment, it had simply vanished. Some members of the federal team suggested that perhaps it had found some kind of underground hiding place, or that it had moved much further into the forest than they had anticipated. Others, in whispered conversations that Kellerman occasionally overheard, suggested far stranger possibilities, theories about portals or forms of transition between different states of existence. Each suggestion seemed more insane than the last, but after what Kellerman had seen, he was no longer in a position to dismiss any possibility as too absurd. Eventually, the operation was called off. The federal teams dismantled their equipment and left as quietly as they had arrived. But before they left, they made all the local officials who had been involved in the case sign lengthy confidentiality agreements. They were warned, in very clear terms, that discussing any aspect of the incident with unauthorized persons would result in severe legal consequences. The official story was that they had pursued a suspected thief who managed to escape into the woods and was never captured. A mundane narrative to cover up a reality that was anything but. Kellerman tried to return to normal work, but found it impossible. Every time he answered a night call, every time he had to investigate an isolated property, he found himself staring into the shadows with an apprehension he couldn't shake. He knew now that there were things in the world that didn't follow the rules everyone assumed to be absolute and immutable, and the thought that there might be more of them, hidden in dark places where light rarely reached, was almost paralyzing. In the months that followed, there were occasional reports from other rural residents in the area seeing something strange near their properties. Figures that didn't move in a proper way, shadows that were too large to be explained by the available light, sounds in the night that didn't correspond to any known animal. None of these reports were officially investigated. Whenever someone tried to make a formal report, they were gently discouraged, their concerns dismissed as imagination or misunderstandings. The Henderson property incident had taught local authorities that there were things that were better left unexamined. Mrs. Henderson never returned to her property. She sold it for well below market value and moved to live with her daughter in another state. When asked why, she simply said the house had become too big for her to manage alone. But those who knew the truth could see the lingering fear in her eyes whenever someone mentioned the property. She had seen something that night that had shattered her sense of security and certainty about the world, and she knew she could no longer live in a place where that thing could return. As for Officer Brad Kellerman, he eventually retired from the department, citing health reasons. The truth was, he could no longer do the job with the same confidence and certainty that had previously characterized his approach. He had looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, and that look had fundamentally changed something within him. He moved to a larger city, a place where the lights never completely went out and where dense forests lay miles away. But even there, he would still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, his heart racing, imagining he had heard that heavy, unnatural breathing sound somewhere in the dark. The body cam footage, confiscated by federal authorities, has never been publicly viewed. It exists in some archive somewhere, catalogued under classifications and codes that most people will never know exist. A piece of physical evidence that the world is far stranger and potentially more dangerous than most people will ever realize. And perhaps that's for the best. Some truths are too heavy for the human mind to comfortably bear. To this day, the forest north of Millbrook remains. The trees sway in the wind, the animals follow their natural cycles, and life continues as it always has. But there are those who know, who have seen or heard things that cannot be easily explained, and they avoid that particular forest, especially after nightfall. Because even if the creature has never been seen again, even if the search teams have never found it, that those who were there that night know a simple and terrifying truth. Whatever it was, whatever it is still out there somewhere in the darkness, waiting